This is the WTF Bach podcast.
Wow, that's fabulous.
Join WTF Bach as he guides your mind through a contrapuntal journey.
Today, we're here with the WTF Bach podcast.
It's WTF Bach here, Evan Schinners, admitting I was wrong. At the end of the first episode in our mini-series covering the canonic variations on Von Himmel hoch, I played a chorale prelude by Pachelbel, or Pachelbel, on the same melody, and I mentioned that, in fact, he was a real composer, not just the culprit responsible for Canon in D. And then I said, listeners of this podcast know that Canon in D is not a canon. Well, I was wrong. Canon in D is a canon, thanks to one of my listeners in New Zealand, very far away fact-checking me, wrote, "What do you mean when you say canon in D isn't a canon?" And I realized, wow, I've actually never looked to see what canon in D is. Pachelbel is a legitimate composer whom Bach admired. Some of the Bachs even studied with Pachelbel. So why does this piece end up being the one butchered by every church organist at your aunt's third wedding? So if you don't mind, I'd like to slightly take a detour from our Bach canon to discuss Pachelbel's canon, which, as it turns out, runs right back into Bach. The canon in D was in fact written with a jig, so it's canon followed by the jig, and it is suggested that it was written for Johann Christoph Bach's wedding. That's Bach's older brother, whom he eventually went to live with shortly after their parents died. Now, Johann Christoph was married in 1694, and their father, Johann Ambrosius, died the following year, which means that, indeed, if this piece of music was composed for Bach's brother's wedding, then the first time it was heard, Bach and his father were there, naturally at the wedding of Bach's older brother. Now, you know that most Baroque music was never published. It is lost to the annals of time. Bach's music, being exceptional, was only first published after exhaustive research and teams of people working together in the 19th century, and so too Pachelbel's music late to publishing. This piece, the Canon in D, wasn't published until 1919, and it was recorded very early in 1938, and that recording sounds a little bit like this. That is Hermann Diener and his orchestra, credited with the first recording of Pachelbel's Canon. Now, I think that we are used to hearing that a bit slower. Still, it has that 1930s feel, very, very stately, we could say. I think for reference, however, it probably would have sounded the piece something like this in terms of tempo in the 1690s. See, it's not so boring when you play it like that. I mean, when a composer in the Baroque writes 30-second notes, I tend to think that they are flying virtuosically off the page like that. That is a group called Tempesta di Mare out of Philadelphia, I believe. Okay, so anyways, we've got sort of the first recording and maybe how it sounded in the 1690s. Then comes along the 60s, the swinging 60s. Enter 1968 and a man named Jean-François Pellard, and he makes the recording that, well, it breaks this piece forever. I won't play it on the podcast because it is one of the most famous recordings of classical music ever, but that is the one that you know squeezes every single bit of emotion slower and slower and slower, and just, this is the one, this tempo, I mean, really, this is the tempo of the Pellard recording, and this recording was an absolute hit. And then, of course, we're in the era of rock bands covering classical music, Procol Harum, everyone like that. So in 1968, just after this is released, apparently a Greek band named Aphrodite's Child releases a single, Rain and Tears. And it was number one on the pop charts of various European countries. And it doesn't stop there. In October of the same year, a Spanish pop band releases Oh Lord, Why Lord? Again, based on Pachelbel's Canon. And then Parliament, the funk band, in 1970 covers this. Then this Pellard recording starts to become very well known in the 1970s in San Francisco. This was just played on the radio over and over and over again. People were always calling up, requesting that Pachelbel's Canon recording, and it was used in television ads, and its fame gradually led it off the rails and to hundreds of arrangements for solo piano, for flute and piano, for children's chorus, soprano recorder, guitar, bass, and piano, for left hand alone, for 4 ukuleles. I'm honestly now just reading from the arrangements on the International Sheet Music Library page. These are some of the horrors that this piece has experienced. Why is this piece so popular? I think it's because of this bass line here. Because that's basically all the makings of a piece of pop music. We've got the same chords over and over and over again, just as it is in pop music. We've got a nice, comfy major chord, then sort of going away from it into the minor chords. Oh yes, those minor chords. We love just the right amount of sad. And of course, when you're in California in the 70s, maybe you're enjoying a substance that makes this harmonic journey seem a bit more epic than it actually is. There's a viral video where a few musicians tell you that you could play 90% of all the pop hits by just learning 4 chords. Well, Pachelbel's Canon, the first 3 chords are exactly the same, and then that 4th chord is just delayed by 1. So this really has the makings of what later became pop music. So how is this piece a canon? Well, if you look at the original, you'll see that it is in fact 3 violins playing the same line one after the other, as in a real canon. And I'm going to play that line for you now and spare you the bass line, which is the horror of all cellists, and just play the line in 3 different areas in your speaker in 3 different tones. I just want to read you something here that sort of had an influence on me from my earliest years reading about music, and I remembered this, and this probably plays into my bias about this piece of music. This is from an interview between the great David Duval, one of my good friends, and Andras Schiff, the pianist. They have an interview in Duval's book called Reflections from the Keyboard, and Schiff says something like this: "Yes, all the noise around us hurts me. Traffic noise, street noise, amplified rock and roll. People come to a concert and can't hear pianissimo passages anymore. Their ears have been destroyed. I'm sure that in Handel and Bach's time, people had better hearing." David Duval says, "The world has to have been quieter then." Schiff continues, "But I find that most people today don't want silence. They want noise all the time, and that includes that ridiculous thing called Pachelbel's Canon. That's now the most well-known piece of Baroque music. It's on TV, it's in the movies, on the radio. You cannot escape Pachelbel's Canon." So I must have read that interview when I was 15 or something like that, and that has clearly played into my feelings about this piece, but I'm going to try and play it for you now in a very, very sanitized way. The first voice in your left speaker, the second voice in both speakers, and the third voice in your right speaker, played mathematically and in 3 different tones, so that any extra musical sentiment, any of the burdens that we are carrying from this piece will be washed away, and maybe we can actually see it for some of the inventiveness that this composer Pachelbel, whom Bach so admired, was renowned for. piece ends there, but I've tapered the last two lines. You'll see the first line is out, and now the second line is out, leaving us with the ending. So in fact, that was the same line of music, just copied and pasted and staggered by a few moments. And why don't I try something else? Why don't I try the same line, but now I'll try it in 6 voices, and let's see what happens. We can do that on this podcast. That's the third voice. So that's authentic Pachelbel. Now here's the fourth voice. Seems to be working still. Here's the fifth voice. Sixth voice. Okay, it seems to be working. I'm going to try it now in 12 voices. I really want to try and break Pachelbel's canon, like Pachelbel did, but I want to do it in a bit of a different way. We started already with 3 voices. There's 4. Number 5. And number 6. So can we break it? Here's 7. And number 8. And number 9. And number 10. This is 11 voices. Here's 12. Well, that's it. Pachelbel's canon is unbreakable. No matter how many voices you do, apparently this line of music, there's something about this chord progression that is essentially unbreakable. Maybe that's why Schiff doesn't like it. Maybe that's why people have a bias against it who are deeply into music. They think, it's a piece of pop classical music. I'm not sure. What do you think? Tell me. This piece, in any case, was written alongside the jig, so we are now going to hear the American Bach soloists play the jig that was composed alongside the canon, and we can maybe walk away from this show thinking that Pachelbel was in fact a very decent composer, and, we all don't like our number 1 hit. So for some promo, followed by the jig. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks for listening to the WTF Bach podcast. We couldn't make this podcast without the support from listeners like you. The best way to help this podcast along is to become a paid subscriber on Evan's Substack. So if you join for as little as $80 a year, just $80, you'll be helping us out tremendously. You can also make a one-time donation on Venmo, Cash App, or PayPal. All relevant links are found in this episode's description. And we want to hear from you. So if you have an idea, a favorite piece, or a suggestion, give us a shout at Bach@WTFBach.com. We get notes almost every week from every corner of the globe, and it makes our days to hear from you. So thank you for listening.